Sainte Thomas Honour We, through whose blood holy church is made free. Saint Thomas Honour We, through whose blood holy church is made free. Saint Thomas Honour We, through whose blood holy church is made free. So, I'd like to introduce Tom Holland of The Rest is History podcast, and a champion of bringing discussion around Christianity to a much broader audience and placing it into a much wider context, the context of humanity itself and everything that's come. And that was a 15th century chant to St. Thomas Becket, and I think we're going to hear a bit about that.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful way to be introduced. I don't know how I can follow that up. And I gather that when I finish, you're going to hear from someone who has just completed the pilgrimage to Santiago. And so I am going to begin by talking about a pilgrimage that never happened. I am the failure, and she'll be followed by a successful pilgrim. And the pilgrimage that I failed was one that I was planning to embark on in the spring of 2020. And it was a pilgrimage to Stonehenge that I was going to do with my brother. And our aim in undertaking this pilgrimage was to try and raise the profile of a campaign that we were both involved in against the government's disreputable plan to build a road tunnel through underneath the Stonehenge landscape. And our aim was that we were going to end up at Stonehenge. But the problem was we had to work out, well, where are we going to begin our pilgrimage? I mean, there's no question that Stonehenge was absolutely, I think, a place of pilgrimage back in the Neolithic. It's a place called Durrington Walls. It's a place. It was a place of the living, as opposed to Stonehenge, a place of the dead. It was a great village. Seems to have been settled there for about 60 years. Place of great feasting. All kinds of animal carcasses have been found there, and some of these pigs were driven all the way from Scotland. And so that implies that there were definitely kind of long-distance pilgrims coming to Salisbury Plain back in the Neolithic. But obviously we had no way of knowing if there were particular locations from which people set out on pilgrimage. And so instead we drew on archaeology. And in particular, one of the prize exhibits in the museum in Salisbury, where my brother and I had grown up. And if we could just have the next, you can see, there it is, how thrilling. This is the Amesbury Archer, so called from the many arrowheads with which it was found buried, and also because it was dug up during the construction of a new housing estate in Amesbury, the nearest town to Stonehenge. And what's fascinating about this guy, quite apart from his skills in archery, is the fact that he's not from Britain, but from the Alps. This is what the science apparently proves. And so we thought, well, he's an international, to get international attention for our campaign against the road tunnel. And so we thought we would start from Dover, and we would cross the North Downs, following the North Down Way, and head towards Salisbury. And we were looking forward to it. We were going to do it in April. It was going to be absolutely brilliant. But then, of course, Boris and COVID intervened. Bless him. And so rather than striding out across the Downs, I found myself immured in London, in Brixton, where I live, and with absolutely no prospect of escaping the capital, no prospect of following the North Downs way. And March, of course, turned to April. And I'm sure you will all remember that the weather in those early weeks of the lockdown was tantalizingly beautiful. And the more beautiful it was, the more perfect each day was that followed each perfect day. So my sense of regret for the pilgrimage that might have been deepened. And go to Canterbury or go out onto the North Downs, we did what we could legally do, which was to set out on walks from our front door and explore what was around us, namely the capital. And our first walk, we did this we got up very, very early on Easter morning, having watched the previous day, 28 days later, which some of you may have seen, about a pandemic that breaks out in Britain and wipes pretty much everyone out and turns those who aren't killed into zombies. And it opens with this shot, basically, Westminster Bridge completely empty. And it was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. And it set us up for our next walk, which was themed by the War of the Worlds, another apocalyptic nightmare that overwhelms London. And there is a chapter when the narrator, Richard Burton in the Jeff Lynne musical, he comes to London after everyone has fled and London has been conquered by the Martians. And Wells gives a description of his journey from Putney Bridge, where he's been hanging out with David Essex, for those who've listened to the musical. And he heads all the way across London, and of course he finds that the Martians are dead, wiped out themselves in a pandemic. And the descriptions are so precise that you can follow the narrator's route absolutely clearly. And it's full of passages along the lines of, we arrived at South Kensington, the tube station was silent, nothing moved. And that's exactly what we experienced. So it felt like a pilgrimage into the heart of a great literary classic. And then with all these thoughts of journeys, of pilgrimages, of people having, of walks that were kind of mapped out for us, we went for the big one. We went to Talbot Yard. And then we went down the Old Kent Road, and then we walked up to Blackheath. And there we had to stop because obviously we couldn't carry on. We had to get back to our house. But I really, really yearned to carry on. And I wanted to go on and on all the way to Canterbury, a pilgrimage that would have taken me out of London, away from the pandemic-hit city, out into the clear air of Kent. And of course, in doing that, we would have been following in the footsteps of the most celebrated pilgrims in the whole of English literature. And so that April, which for everyone enduring lockdown was the cruelest month, I returned to the Canterbury Tales for the first time since early 20s. And I read a poem by a man who all his life had lived in the shadow of pandemic. Chaucer was a young child when the Black Death first arrived on the shores of England in the summer of 1348. And in fact, Chaucer was not far from the first place to report a recorded incident. The first case of the Black Death certainly reported was in Weymouth on the south coast, and Chaucer was in Southampton. And the reason for that was that his father was he was a very kind of posh wine dealer, and he'd become wine dealer to the king himself, and so he was in Southampton to monitor the import of all the royal wines. And probably this saved Chaucer, because even though he was, part of the south coast, the first to be hit by the Black Death, at least he had the consolation of not being in London, which was disproportionately hit by the Black Death. And Chaucer was a Londoner. All the Chaucers were there, and lots of their relatives were killed in the Black Death. And this was probably Chaucer's making, because that meant that his father and mother were left substantial properties. And it was this that enabled Chaucer to get a very, very good education and to end up becoming a courtier at the royal court. And right the way over the course of his life, London and England like the whole of Europe. There were repeated visitations of the Black Death. And even though by the time that Chaucer came to write the Canterbury Tales, London seemed to have recovered. So there were teeming docks and there were cranes everywhere, and there was such kind of pressure on housing that people were doing loft conversions all over the city. Nevertheless, the plague was always there. It had ceased to come in waves. It had basically become endemic. And so it was a constant background presence for Chaucer as he was writing the Canterbury Tales, as it had been throughout his entire life. Now, what is interesting, as has often been noted by critics, is that the Black Death doesn't seem to be, at least, a major presence in the Canterbury Tales. There are only a very few overt references to it. The figure of Saturn, the terrifying king who devours his children, boasts to his daughter Venus, "My looking is the father of pestilence." And in the Pardoner's Tale, which I think is perhaps the greatest of all the tales, there's an even more explicit reference. So 3 rioters, 3 people who are debauching themselves, are told news of a friend, and something terrible has happened to this friend. "There came a privy thief, men clapeth death, that in this country all the people sleth, and with his spear he smote his heart to twoe, and went his way without word as moe. He hath 1,000 slain this pestilence." And so the rioters decide that they will go in search of Death and punish him. Death shall be dead. And they meet a strange old man, and they say, "Where is Death?" And the old man says, "You will find Death under a tree," and points them to a tree in the wood. And so the rioters go there, and rather than someone called Death, they find a treasure trove, a case full of gold coin. And they decide that they will take it away. And so one of the men is deputed to go into town and to source a cart and to bring it back. And so he goes into town and he thinks, "You know what? I'm going to buy some wine, I'm going to put some poison in it, and then I can have the whole lot." Meanwhile, back at the tree, his 2 companions are thinking, "Why should we share it with this third guy? Let's just kill him when he comes back and then we can have it between ourselves." So the guy comes back with his wine and the cart. He gets killed. The 2 guys celebrate by drinking the wine. It's poisoned. They all die. So a very haunting tale, but also, I think, rooted in deep experience. So the great inspiration for the Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, the great collection of short stories written by Boccaccio, the Florentine writer. In the Decameron, wild living is cast as a response to the Black Death. There's a sense that everyone's going to die, so you might as well make merry now while you can. And this same perspective is something that is absolutely evident in English moralists of the time. The immorality of those who live in a time of plague is a kind of constant theme. So there's a guy, a monk at St. Albans called Thomas Walsingham, who is of the Peasants' Revolt, but also more generally for the 14th century. And he writes of the people of London in the aftermath of plague. Of all people, they were the proudest, the most arrogant, the most greedy. So the sense that debauchery is a response to plague, this is something that seems to be current across the whole of Christendom. But there is, of course, another response to plague, and that is pilgrimage. And that April, as I was reading the Canterbury Tales, as I was following in the footsteps of the pilgrims, I found myself alert to the goal of Chaucer's pilgrims to a degree that I had never been before. So why are they going to Canterbury? Guy just, sang the answer for us beautifully. To Canterbury they wend, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, that hem hath holpen when that they were sick. And this, of course, was a period where there was no vaccine at all on the horizon. And the yearning for the pandemic to end, the yearning for health to be restored to the world, I felt that so powerfully, as I'm sure all of you did. And I could understand that might have inspired pilgrims in the 14th century to go to Thomas's shrine, to pray for a cure more powerfully than I had ever done before. And I think that what is fascinating is that Chaucer had particular personal reasons to hold Saint Thomas in veneration. So he had, when he was in London and then when he went back after his father's term in Southampton, his parish church had an altar to St. Thomas, so he would have prayed before it pretty much every week. And as an adult, he becomes a diplomat. He's constantly going to the continent on royal missions. And the route from London, where he lived, to Dover, of course, would have taken him past Canterbury, past the cathedral, past the great shrine to St. Thomas. And in going there, he would have crossed London Bridge and he would have passed the chapel to St. Thomas in the middle of that bridge, which was the traditional starting point for pilgrimages to Canterbury. So St. Thomas, I am sure, was a very, very personal saint to Chaucer. Now, famously, of course, Chaucer's pilgrims never actually arrive. By the time that they reach the limits of the city in the poem, they're kind of like aircraft over Heathrow on a particularly busy day. They're just in a kind of holding pattern going round and round and round. But what I hadn't fully contemplated before that spring of 2020 was how they had failed to start their pilgrimage properly as well, because they, of course, don't start it from the shrine to St. Thomas on London Bridge. Famously, they start it from the Tabard, the place that I'd been to during the pandemic. Befell that in that season on a day in Southwark at the Tabard as I lay, ready to wenden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage, at night were come into that hostelry, well 29 in a company of sundry folk, by aventure full, in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury would and ride. The chambers and the stables were and wide, and well we were in ease at a best, and shortly, when the sun was to rest, so had I spoken with them every on, that I was of her fellowship anon. So when I walked that pilgrimage route through Southwark in April 2020, it was shut. There were no crowded bars. There was no meeting up with strangers. And it struck me anew that the Canterbury Tales is a celebration of everything that comes from not having to socially distance. And I wondered anew at that famous first line of the poem, the insistence on April. Is there something, I wondered, more than just the kind of the lengthening of the days that encouraged people to go on pilgrimage in that month? I mean, Chaucer says the shower's sweeter. I mean, there may be sweet showers, but they're still showers. There must have been something about April that made people want to get out there. And what perhaps he didn't need to specify for his readers, but which we perhaps can miss, is that April was the month traditionally when the plague that was endemic in London began to abate. So we know this from the deathbed wills. People have gone through them. And we know that in the wake of the original wave of the Black Death, that the months of January, February, and March were particularly lethal months in London and across Northern Europe generally. And actually what's interesting and strange is that in Italy, fatalities worsened drastically, not in the winter but in the summer, and they began in May. And Chaucer was a regular visitor to Italy. So again, perhaps that sense that April is when the plague is less virulent. You have the chance to go out and meet people in pubs and talk to them and become friends and be invited to accompany them on their journey. Because, there's no germ theory in the 14th century, but people in that period absolutely understood the principle of social distancing in a pandemic. So Boccaccio's great story, The Decameron, consists of aristocrats who leave Florence to go to an estate outside the city where they keep themselves in and kind of tell stories. And the whole point is that they're not mixing with the masses. And so I wondered, is this why Chaucer is so precise? I mean, the very first line, specifying the time of year when his pilgrims met at the Tabard and embarked on their journey to Canterbury. And in that sense, is the whole great cycle of the Canterbury Tales a eulogy to the joys in a time of endemic plague of social mixing. Now, I don't know the answer to that because I don't know what was in Chaucer's mind as he wrote it. But what I do know is that I wanted really desperately to believe it. As I was reading the Canterbury Tales in those early weeks of the lockdown, I really, really wanted to believe it. And so, essentially, this is what I felt in my heart, if not my head, as I was walking the kind of the empty street in the footsteps of those Canterbury pilgrims, that living in a time of pandemic had brought me closer to an understanding of Chaucer and of the pilgrims. And I think that this isn't an inherently risible and inherently kind of ill-disciplined idea. So as well as the Canterbury Tales, I was reading a brilliant biography of Chaucer by Marion Turner, the great scholar of the poet. And she, in the introduction to her book, said that to try to understand the imagination of the poet, throughout this book, I explore the things that surrounded him, the streets he walked, the communities in which he participated, and the structures that he inhabited. But at the same time, I also felt, with a kind of renewed ache, a much sharper ache than I'd felt before, just how profound a distance separated me from Chaucer, separated me from the pilgrims. Because if I'd felt in my longing for a vaccine, for an end to COVID and to lockdowns and everything, some hint perhaps of the yearning that the pilgrims might have had to reach the shrine of Saint Thomas, that hem hath holpen when that they were sick, I realized that it was essentially my materialism that had prevented me from taking Chaucer's pilgrims, and of course Chaucer himself, as seriously as perhaps they should have been taken. I had been too seduced by all the manifold riches of the Canterbury Tales, the comedy, the romance, the deftness of the character portrayals, the sketches of character, the interactions, to recognize that alongside all those kind of great, often comedic riches, there was also this terrible ache of need, this kind of yearning for healing and for comfort. And I remember particularly how, when I'd originally read the Canterbury Tales, it ends, I thought, on a very downbeat, dull note. So the concluding sentence of the Canterbury Tales is a prayer by Chaucer to the Virgin and to all the saints of heaven for salvation. Through the benign grace of him that is King of kings and priest over all the priests, that bought us with the precious blood of his heart, so that I may be one of them at the day of doom that shall be saved. And I'd read that and I thought, well, that's a really dull way to end a poem. But now I thought, no, that's not dull. That is incredibly moving. That is a man in the shadow of death. And I found it revelatory, and I found it moving, and I found that it made me want to go on pilgrimage even more than when I'd, begun the Canterbury Tales. Now the question is, we're now at a distance from that period, from the pandemic. And so the question that I ask myself is, was I right? History is not a science. It is absolutely shaped by our own personal experiences. It's kind of kaleidoscopic. You can have new experiences, new perspectives that alter and change and influence your understanding of the past. So this was famously articulated by Edward Gibbon, who had served in the local militia, and wrote that the captain of the Hampshire Grenadiers, the reader may smile, has not been useless to the historian of the Roman Empire. So his experience, he felt, had informed his understanding of the ancient past. But at the same time, of course, it is absolutely incumbent on us not just to assume that people in the past were essentially us only in weird clothes. They, in so many ways, are very different. And I think that the status of the Canterbury Tales as the kind of the great foundational work of English literature, much more than kind of other really amazing works of literature that were written at the same time, I think is due to the sense we have that it is actually quite close to us. The sense that the pilgrims offer us a kind of cross-section of Middle England, that the multiplicity of perspectives, the jokes, the humour is kind of vivid to us in a way that, Piers Plowman or even The Green Knight isn't. And this is why, novelists and scriptwriters and so on, it's why they find it so incredibly adaptable. And yet I think at the same time, these similarities can be deceptive. And there are absolutely, in the 21st century, two very obvious reasons why I think so many of us yourselves excluded, you are members of the British Pilgrimage Trust, but all the rest of us, there's a reason, I think, why we may be blind to the value and the potency of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. And the first of these, obviously, is that we live in a culture that for half a millennium has been Protestant. So there is no cult of Saint Thomas in Canterbury Cathedral. I've just come back from Orkney, where the relics of St. Magnus are still preserved in the cathedral named after him. But there's nothing like that at Canterbury. There is only an empty space where the great shrine of St. Thomas, described as a shrine of gold, all gone. Henry VIII's agents demolished it all. So there's nothing left of that blissful martyr whose relics was thought by Chaucer and his pilgrims to offer them the hope of healing. But I think even more saliently than that, we live in a culture that is determinedly materialist. So I've read lots of books on the Canterbury Tales, and I don't think that in any of them have I read it as a suggestion that perhaps those relics of St. Thomas could actually have healed the sick, and that the stated impetus of the pilgrims to go there to be healed might actually literally be taken seriously. And yet it should be, because Chaucer was a deeply, deeply religious man. All through his life, he enjoyed very close ties to religious institutions, and he's buried in Westminster Abbey not because he was a poet, even though his tomb is the kind of the foundation of Poets' Corner. He's buried there because he had close ties to the monks in Westminster Abbey, and he wanted to be a part of what they represented. And the venomous brilliance of his portrayal of the pardoner, who tells that incredible story. He is a swindler who makes his living by exploiting the faith of the devout. This is not Chaucer criticizing pilgrimage or relics or faith. It's Chaucer criticizing those who would exploit it. So pilgrimage in the Canterbury Tales is not just a plot device, and I think that to assume otherwise is to be guilty of absolutely grievous anachronism. And the implication in turn of that is that perhaps the further back in time we go and we look at pilgrimage, the more of a kind of effort of will is required from us to try and think ourselves into the mindset of the people who are undertaking these journeys. So if we go back maybe 3 centuries from the time of Chaucer's pilgrimage, back to the 11th century, there is a massive upsurge of pilgrimages in the early decades of the 11th century. And people, contemporaries looking at these pilgrimages, are aware that they are strange. So we have the opinions of a monk in the great Burgundian abbey, and he says of these pilgrimages, these great kind of mass journeys that sees people crossing Europe, that they portended nothing other than the advent of the accursed Antichrist, who, according to divine testimony, is expected to appear at the end of the world. And the monk recognized in these pilgrimages a profound yearning for Christ, a yearning for earth to be joined with heaven, a yearning that paralleled the yearnings that were felt by the monks in Cluny itself, because it was the ambition of the monks in Cluny to emulate the angelic choirs of paradise. And they did this by singing hymns, psalms, chants of praises all day to an absolutely unprecedented degree. And the truest mark of their more than human status, their angelic status, was that they could boast a purity that derived from the fact that they were independent of earthly lords. Exceptionally, unlike other monasteries, Cluny did not owe obedience to a local magnate, to a local prince, to a king, to an emperor. The only loyalty they owed, the only dues they owed, was to the Pope in far-off distant Rome, and, of course, to St. Peter, the first of the popes. And this is in Cluny because he felt himself hallowed by this sense of independence and of closeness to heaven, was so ready, I think, to recognize in the pilgrimages a similar yearning, a similar instinct. And the greatest of all these pilgrimages happened in 1033. A great mass of pilgrims from across Latin Christendom set off to arrive in time for Easter in Jerusalem. And you have to ask yourself, well, what were they expecting? What had made them want to go in 1033 to Jerusalem? Whatever it was, it didn't happen. There was no joining of heaven to earth, and there was no second coming of Christ. Because, of course, 1033 was the millennial anniversary of the death and resurrection of Christ. And it seems highly implausible that this is not what was inspiring that great pilgrimage, the hope that 1,000 years on, Christ himself might appear. But he doesn't, and so the Christians of Europe are thrown back on their own resources, and it's in this context that Cluny serves them as a great inspiration and a model. Proof that even though Christ himself has not returned, a new Jerusalem can be built. This is what Cluny comes to seem to devout Christians across Europe. And so the dream starts to be fostered in Rome, in the great centres of education, wherever there are people pondering and weighing the options for the Christian people in the shadow of the millennium, that the whole of the church might be cleansed and purified in the way that Cluny had been purified. In other words, that the kind of the grubby handprints of earthly lords could be forced away. And such a project, of course, would need leadership, and the leadership over the course of the 11th century was provided by the papacy. And the result was what has been described variously as the papal or the Gregorian revolution after Gregory VII, who was the most famous of all these kind of revolutionary popes. He's the man who makes the emperor kneel in snow and beg for absolution outside the castle of Canossa in the Apennines. And the process of cleansing the church is revolutionary because it constructs the notion of there being twin dimensions, a dimension of religio, which is the bond to heaven, and the saeculum, the sweeping of the ages, which is the dimension of death. And so that sense that there is the saeculum and there is religio, this comes to be enshrined in this period as something profound and enduring. And of course, it's still with us in the notion of there being something called the secular and the idea of there being religion. Prior to this period, that concept had not existed. But from the 11th century onwards, this idea that there is something separate from religion comes to bed down, and we are absolutely, therefore, the heirs of this revolution. And the study of history in the modern world, like so much else, is itself the heir of this revolution. History is meant to be secular. There is no room in it, as it is practiced academically, for any idea that the supernatural might have a role to play. And I think that this is why when academics today and for several centuries have looked at this period, there has been a definite squeamishness about attributing the convulsions of the age, the pilgrimages and so on, to an overt religiosity. The idea that people in Europe were anxious about the millennium has been seen as a kind of a 19th century fairy tale. The false terrors of the year 1000, they're often described as. And in academic circles, the profound changes and convulsions of the millennial period is generally explained in economic terms. You know, it's changes in the nature of the plough or things like that. But I think recently that sense has begun to shift. And I think that it's for a couple of reasons. And just as the experience of COVID, I think, has kind of influenced the way that people are prepared to look at how people reacted to the Black Death, so similarly, our sense of what might have been happening around the year 1000 has been changed by two other recent events. One of which, of course, is the fact that we have actually lived through a millennium ourselves. We know what it's like to worry about computers breaking down or whatever, and also to have hopes of a new age that then get disappointed. And the other, I think, influence on people's willingness to look again to a kind of religious context is that we likewise have begun experiencing existential anxieties about the possibility that the world might be coming to an end, particularly focused on climate change. So in 2006, James Lovelock, inventor of the Gaia thesis, he wrote, "Our future is like that of the passengers on a small pleasure boat, sailing quietly above the Niagara Falls, not knowing that the engines are about to fail." And this was in a book in which he predicted that by 2020 the whole of Europe would be uninhabitable. More than 1,000 years ago, an abbot at Cluny drew upon a very similar metaphor. So he said that humanity was on board a ship, on board a vessel, and that it was beset all around by a gathering storm surge. Perilous times are menacing us, and the world is threatened with its end. Now, the parallels, of course, are not exact, but I do think they are suggestive. And I think that they serve to help historians in 2024 to kind of overcome their instinctive materialism and to contemplate seriously the possibility that the anxieties and yearnings that prompted people in the first decades of the 11th century to go on these extraordinary pilgrimages continue to shape how we understand the world to this very day. They offer reflections, perhaps, that do indeed, I think, kind of flicker and twist in a distant mirror. But what if we go even further back in time to a period before materialism, before Protestantism, before Christianity itself? So I want to end, looked at pilgrims in the 14th century, I've looked at pilgrims in the 11th century. But what if we go back 1,000 years and then another half of a millennium before that, back to ancient Athens, and back to a journey that was undertaken by young girls every year in classical Athens. Sorry, not every year, every 4 years. And every fourth year, all girls who were kind of around the age of 10 would go from Athens and they would process out to a temple on the Attic shoreline called Brauron. And this was a shrine that was sacred to Artemis, the virgin huntress, the mistress of beasts, very fearsome goddess, capable of inflicting unspeakable horrors on anyone who offended her, and by extension on a city that might offend her. And sure enough, it was to appease the anger of Artemis that the girls of Athens would head out to Brauron, because it was said that once a group of Athenian young men had killed a bear, and that this bear had been sacred to Artemis, and so the goddess had sent a plague to devastate the city. And we're told by a Greek scholar, the Athenians consulted Delphi and were informed that the plague would only be brought to an end if their young daughters, as blood price for the death of the beast, were obliged themselves to become bears. So it was that a law of the Athenians forbade any girl being given in marriage unless she had first turned into a bear and served Artemis. So what is going on here? Now, there have been all kinds of theories, as you can imagine. Maybe it was a puberty rite, an initiation rite, an expiation rite. But what no scholar has ever suggested is that what the sources tell us might actually have been true. That the reason that reports were made about girls going to this temple and turning into bears is because they really did. And it's not surprising, because there are lots of Catholics around today who absolutely would believe that Saint Thomas's relics could have cured the sick. But there's no one around who believes that Artemis existed, still less that girls going to her temple might conceivably have actually literally turned into bears. But there's a real problem for trying to make sense of what was going on, not just with this, but with Athens more generally in this period. Because essentially, what we as as materialists who do not believe in the Greek gods are saying is that we are laying claim to an understanding of the classical past that is superior to those who actually experienced it. But you have to wonder, how valid actually is our knowledge at this incredible distance? How accurately can we hope to understand the ancient Athenians if we refuse to take seriously, to feel kind of in our heart, in our gut, the seriousness of beliefs that absolutely animated their entire way of life and their understanding of what life was about and for? Now, there's a scholar called Greg Anderson who's focused in on this question of what, the huge problem that comes from not actually believing in the Greek gods. He wrote this: "What would the Athenians' celebrated politeia look like if we no longer viewed it through the lens of conventional historicism, using our standard modern analytical template? How different does their democracy appear when we try to see it more on their terms, in the world of their experience?" And in his attempt to answer this question, he does touch on this journey, this pilgrimage of Athenian girls out to Brauron and the temple of Artemis. And he points out a general perception felt not just by the Athenians, but by the Greeks more generally, that the gods felt a special affinity with human females, that women and girls are felt by the Greeks to be closer to the divine than men. And there are two, I think, with this perspective, two salient features of this pilgrimage to the Temple of Artemis at Brauron. The first is, of course, that the girls become bears, and the second is that they spend time with Artemis in a way that no boy ever does. And remember that comment that an Athenian girl can only marry someone if she has had this. If that's true, then it means that every Athenian man, when he looks at his wife, is looking at someone who has become a bear and who has run with Artemis. And you've got to feel that would instill a certain nervous respect. And I think in turn, that then kind of opens up all kinds of fascinating implications on the Athenian democracy. The thing that people always criticize the Athenian democracy for is the fact that it's only the men who have the vote. People always say, well, what about women? But that's because our understanding of democracy is based on ideas of rights. Men have the right to vote, therefore women should have the right to vote. But that's not at all how the Athenians understood it. The Athenians saw everyone born into the state of Athens, women as well as men, as being part of a continuum that reached backwards in time and stretched forwards into the future. And in this continuum, women had a role to play that was just as important as that of men. Men had the vote because it was their duty to keep the day-to-day running of Athens on the road. This is also why they go out to fight. They're doing the day-to-day stuff. But it's the job of women to keep the gods happy, not just Artemis, but of course the goddess after whom Athens is actually named, Athena. And this is why it is far more than men who conduct the rites and perform the sacrifices and lead the processions that ensure divine protection for Athens. This is not less important than voting or fighting. In all kinds of ways, it is much, much more important. And that is a perspective I think you can only get if you take those pilgrimages undertaken by those 10-year-old girls out to Brauron seriously. And in turn, I think the implication for that is that we cannot hope to understand the past unless we open ourselves up to the possibility that what inspired people to undertake pilgrimage in the past might be true for us as well. That it opens up portals of the strange, of the weird, that otherwise are closed to us. And that is why, basically, I think you cannot possibly be a historian without undertaking pilgrimages. Thank you very much.